Welcome to the IISS office here in Washington. Thank you for coming to joining us in this event on Western defense reassurances to the Gulf Arab states after the Iran nuclear deal. In today's discussion, we'd like to explore questions of whether the post-Iran deal arms sales to the GCC states meet the goal of reassurance as they was intended, whether the arms sales from the different NATO countries are in any way complementary or purely competitive from a commercial standpoint, and how the sales are affecting the geopolitics of the region. When we set up this event, I'd like to boast that I had the clarity to think that the President would be in Saudi Arabia while we are speaking up here, but it turns out to have been coincidental. So joining me are four panelists who have a deep expertise in the issues and in the area of the Middle East. Kicking off will be Ellen Labson, one of the IISS loyal council members and most effective council members, if I may say. She's a distinguished fellow and president emeritus of the Stimson Center, where she formerly directed the Middle East Southwest Asia program, which covers issues including Gulf security and the strategic repercussions of the Arab transitions. Before joining the Stimson Center in 2002, Ellen served with the U.S. government for 25 years, most recently as vice chair of the National Intelligence Council. She also served on the State Department's policy planning staff, where I believe I first met her, and she was a specialist in Middle East affairs for the Congressional Research Service. Michael Eisenstadt will follow. He's the Kahn Fellow and Director of the Washington Institute's Military and Security Studies Program. A specialist in Persian Gulf and Arab-Israeli security affairs, he's published widely on irregular and conventional warfare and nuclear weapons proliferation in the Middle East. Prior to joining the Washington Institute in 1989, he worked as a military analyst with the U.S. government. And I see he's just finishing up his remarks as I filibuster. Okay. Caroline Herndal is head of the Middle East team at the British Embassy in Washington. Caroline's career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has been centered around conflict, civilian military affairs, and post-conflict reconstruction. Her previous positions have included working as political advisor to the U.S. Marine General Larry Nicholson during his time as commander of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade in Helmand, Afghanistan. When I asked Caroline how she earned the initials that follow her name, member of the British Empire, it was for her distinguished service in Afghanistan. I've just never met anybody so young who has those initials after her name. Unlike the other members of the panel, Caroline is a recent friend, met at a event just about a month ago, and I quickly dragooned her into coming to IISS. And finally, Bilal Saab is a subject matter expert on Middle East security and politics with a particular focus on the countries of the Levant and the Gulf Cooperative Council. He's a senior fellow for Middle East security and chairman of the ISIS War Game Series and Gulf Policy Working Group at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. So our event today is going to go for an hour and a half. If there is a question and discussion that will fill up an hour and a half. We thought we'd go longer than the usual hour because we've got four speakers and we want to give full vent to their views and to the subject matter. This event is on the record. It's being live streamed, as will the Q&A that follows the presentation. So, Ellen, if you could kick us off and set the issues and the framework.
Well, good morning, everybody. So I thought when the Iran agreement was achieved, we had this, terrific cooperation among the Permanent Five plus Germany. So we have some of the major Western allies deeply committed to this process of reducing the threat of Iran's nuclear capabilities in the interest of general Gulf security. So I thought the question emerged in the post-agreement phase, are we coordinating together to build even further the benefits of the agreement, and or are our allies in Europe experiencing the same thing the United States is, which is a shiver of new insecurity that some of our friends and partners in the region feel because they worry about a strategic opening towards Iran that, with or without nuclear activity capabilities, would be seen as a net negative for the security of the Gulf. So I thought it was worth considering whether countries other than the United States had the same, were feeling the pressure and the expectation to provide reassurances and even, you could say, compensation to the countries of the region who saw the Iran agreement as somehow harmful to their interests. I confess that this whole issue feels a little bit like Alice in Wonderland to me. I mean, it's a little topsy-turvy to me. I thought it was very clear that the United States' interest and objective in negotiating the agreement with Iran was, in fact, to improve the security of the region, to reduce one of the what could have been a great source of instability, at least for a decade or more. But the reaction in the region was somewhat paradoxical, and that's what we're dealing with. So the United States has clearly been scrambling to provide these reassurances. Arms sales is a piece, but not the sum total of the efforts to build stronger leadership relationships. The fact that the president is in the region now and the GCC summit, the second of these GCC summits, is taking place is ample evidence of this new effort on the U.S. part to make the plan, the agreement with Iran more palatable and to rebalance, if you will, the security interests of our longstanding partners in the region. So I tried to probe a little bit and look at how much our existing coalitions of like-minded countries and the NATO Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, how much are these multilateral vehicles engaging in this task of reassurance to the region? And I'm left with a conclusion that this is a uniquely American problem, that I don't see a significant amount of formal, articulated coordination. But of course, our closest allies are doing some similar things, but without the same, I think, political imperative that is happening for the United States. I just happened to be in CENTCOM this week, and my impression was that even the countries that participate very much in the coalition against the Islamic State, in other regional activities, security cooperation, they do it as part of a U.S.-led strategy. They are not necessarily doing it in some kind of formal, everybody's an equal partner alliance structure. And when I looked at the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, I recall, you may recall this came out of the 2004 NATO summit, where NATO decided to do something comparable to what they had done with Mediterranean countries, but immediately understood that it was going to be a little more complicated or a little bit different than what they had done with Mediterranean countries. So the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative was intended to enhance the security of the countries in the region by sort of NATO GCC cooperation, alliance to alliance, if you will, or integrated units that represent a group of like-minded countries. They quickly ran into the reality that each GCC country wanted to make the decision of joining ICI as a national decision, not as a coordinated GCC decision. And sure enough, 4 countries formally engaged with NATO, and the others are still in a kind of friendly but somewhat reserved status. That is, Saudi Arabia and Oman have done something short of full ICI membership. So there is still this question of how do we engage the countries of the Gulf in doing smart things to strengthen their own resilience, so everything from domestic sources of insecurity to the big Iran threat, and other sources of regional instability. The U.S., I think, has been fairly steady and consistent in what it thinks would be best practices for the countries of the region, and some progress surely can be noted, and I hope we'll hear in greater detail how the latest procurement decisions will enhance further some of the interoperability and standardization of major systems, whether it's the missile threat or other more asymmetric threats that are faced in the region. But I am left with an impression that, so we know that there's sometimes friendly competition among the countries that do have deep partnerships. We know that France and the UK have had recent successes in reestablishing some greater ground presence in the region to support security cooperation. So there's, but whether those decisions are done in coordination with some larger strategy in which some core principles of how to enhance Gulf security are made, I find probably missing. I think that somebody described it to me as somewhere between formal and informal coordination, where we're aware of each other's arms sales, we're aware of each other's, training sessions, et cetera, and there's a complementarity that is generally seen as a net positive, but something short of a very formal strategy to provide these reassurances at the collective level. So, Mark, I'm left with sort of a basic, simple answer to the question is that I don't see us working officially and formally from the same page, and that maybe some work needs to be done to make that more of a likelihood. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ellen. Your last words answered the question that I was going to ask, and it laying out the issues and noting the what's missing. The obvious question is, what should we do about that? And let's get into that more during the discussion. Sure. But first of all, Michael, you probably know more about sales to the region, and you've thought more about how countries are reacting to the U.S. attempt to reassure them than almost anybody else I know. So what are your thoughts on this?
We'll find out, I guess. Turn that on. Turn on the mic. Okay. Well, maybe not always good. But anyhow, I'll start off with a few bottom lines up front, just to give you an idea of where we're heading. First of all, I don't think we have a very rigorous understanding of the whole idea of assurance and how it works. We have very well developed ideas about deterrence and compellence. Assurance is supposed to be kind of the adverse side of deterrence. But I think our experience in the last few years in the region has shown that everything we've done to try to reassure or assure our allies has seemed to backfire. So I think it's in part, we don't understand how they look at us and how they look at the world. And as a result, our efforts have failed. And a little bit more on that in a moment. I also mentioned, though I won't go into this very much, I think assurance is a two-way street. There are things we need to do better to assure our allies in order to increase our leverage and to better influence them to do things we want to do. But there's a assurance deficit on both sides. And we see it now in the paper every day with the debate about the 28 pages from the Joint Congressional Intelligence study of 9/11 and also some of the policies of our allies in Syria until a couple of years ago, perhaps, or more recently. And I'll just say, finally, the last point is that I think arms transfers are a necessary but not sufficient part of assurance for reasons that I'll discuss in a minute. You know, the problems that we're having with our allies in the Gulf go back a long way. You could go back to the invasion of Iraq, which in the eyes of many of our Sunni Arab allies, handed the country over to Iraq and to Iran and the Shiites. Our abandonment of Mubarak, although I think there was really not much we could have done that differently during that crisis, and our handling of the civil war in Syria and our outreach to Iran. And as I mentioned before, you know, everything we've tried to do to reassure our Gulf allies seems to have, you know, kind of boomeranged. Arms transfers, in many ways, given our announced intention to rebalance to Asia, at least some of our allies seem to think that this is kind of, you know, here you go, guys, take care of yourselves, see you later, is kind of seen as a parting, you know, kind of gift to enable them to take care of themselves better. Our forward presence, we say all the time, we have 35,000 people in the Gulf. You know, why are you worried? And they'll say, well, what have they done to change the situation in Syria? They're kind of sitting on their bayonets, and they're not doing a lot. And we say we've done all this nuclear diplomacy with Iran in order to cap the threat posed by their program. And they said, well, all you've done is really kind of legitimized Iran as a threshold nuclear state. So everything we've done kind of in a way has not really responded to the anxieties of our allies there, or our partners. In terms of trends in arms transfers, and this is an area where I think we've been perhaps the most active in trying to provide our allies with the wherewithal to defend themselves against the Iranian threat, although there's a paradox there given the president's attitude towards this, which I'll mention in a moment. We've really seen an unprecedented volume of arms transfers to the GCC, both announced and contracts. There was an article just recently in Defense News which cited a State Department official saying that the U.S. government has authorized $33 billion in arms transfers to the Gulf since the Camp David summit last May. That's authorized. That's not necessarily consummated with contracts, but that's a remarkable sum. And I would just say in terms of trends, basically Saudi Arabia and UAE are the two main markets in the region. The others, Kuwait is then perhaps in third, and then you have Qatar and Oman and Bahrain in descending order, are really fall far behind. It's really Saudi Arabia and the UAE. According to the Defense Security Cooperation Agency under President Obama, arms sales to Saudi Arabia reached nearly $48 billion as compared to $16 billion under President George W. Bush. So almost triple during the two 8-year presidencies, to give you one kind of order of magnitude, the sense of the order of magnitude of the transfers. And according to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Saudi Arabia bought 4 times more major weapon systems between 2010 and 2014 than they did in the previous 5-year period. So we're seeing, kind of a very sharp upward trend there. And that's also reflected in UAE purchases. In terms of sellers, U.S. is still the dominant player, although we see a continued trend towards diversification, which goes back at least to the Gulf War in '91, where in the wake of the Gulf War, a lot of Gulf countries tried to buy from as many of the Permanent 5 of the Security Council in order to have as many friends on the Security Council in the future in the event that they need support. But really, it's really the United States, UK, and France are the main actors or players here, although Canada has a major sale to Saudi Arabia, which I'll discuss in a moment, which is a very large sale. Also, what's interesting, in the wake of the '91 war, Russia played a role. The Kuwaitis bought the BM-27 multiple rocket launcher system. The UAE bought the BMT infantry fighting vehicle. But you don't see Russia playing in this arena anymore, in part because I think quality of their systems were not up to snuff compared to Western systems. Support packages were not as good. And most importantly, politically, Russia is seen as the ally of their main regional rival, Iran, and has been supporting Assad in a way that all the Gulf states find very troubling. So now in terms of, let me just dig a little deeper in terms of a number of categories of weapon systems to give you a sense of what they're getting. Let's just start with missile defenses, because this is an area we've been focusing on in recent years. For many years, at least 4 of the 6 Gulf countries have had the Patriot PAC-2, and that system was introduced, I think, I can't remember exactly, in the last decade at least, if not earlier. But there's been a series of sales of the Patriot PAC-3 to 4 of the countries, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And most recently, THAAD. UAE has signed a contract, and there are pretty credible reports that the Saudis and Qataris also want to purchase THAAD. So, and this is an area where I think the United States pretty much has a monopoly still. Okay, strike aircraft. Almost all of the countries, I think all of the countries in the Gulf, really have some kind of major contract recently signed, or they're considering major contracts. Kuwait recently signed, just I think a few weeks ago, signed a contract for 28 Eurofighter Typhoons. They've been waiting for years to hear about a request to purchase about 24 FA-18 Super Hornets. And there was actually a news story just a day or two ago saying that the U.S. is on the verge of approving that. I guess, I think, and this answers one of your questions, I think the Typhoon deal perhaps has moved the system to finally jar that approval loose. Bahrain is considering a midlife upgrade for their F-16s. or possibly buying a Eurofighter Typhoon aircraft. The UAE has been negotiating over the purchase of 60 Rafales from France, but that apparently, there was again reports recently that the negotiations kind of hit some rough turbulence over UAE dissatisfaction of the terms of the deal. So there's a possibility that Eurofighter might, or Boeing might, try to reattack and try to jump into the void here and once again sell Typhoons or F-15s or FA-18s. It's not clear whether they'll bite at this point, but this creates an opportunity. Saudi Arabia in 2011 signed a very large contract to buy 84 more F-15Ss and to upgrade 70 of the F-15Ss that they have. And they very recently signed a contract for 22 Hawk trainers, BAE, Hawk trainers, which is a British aircraft. And then finally, Qatar recently signed a contract for 24 Rafale fighters from France, and they are reportedly interested in buying perhaps 36 F-15 SEEs from the United States. Again, we'll see where that goes. Munitions, actually there's been some very major munitions deals. Just in the last year, the State Department says that the U.S. government and industry delivered 4,500 PGMs to the GCC states. I assume it's the countries mainly involved in Yemen, probably Saudi and maybe UAE, including 1,500 from active U.S. stocks. There was a very big deal in 2013 for standoff munitions to both Saudi and UAE that together were worth about $10 billion. And if you're interested, I got the figures I won't go over now in the interest in time. Armored vehicles, I mentioned the Canadian LAV contract. The sum that's been published in Canada is, I think, $11 billion Canadian. According to open sources, it's 900 vehicles, but the math doesn't add up. That would be a lot more. For 9 billion, 11 billion, which I think is about 9 billion US, I'm not quite sure. That's a lot more vehicles, even if you account for support packages and stuff, it seems to me. And then finally, we have a sale of 4 littoral combat ships to Saudi Arabia, which was recently announced for over $11 billion, okay? Now, what's interesting, I mentioned the paradox, the Obama paradox before, because in one of his Tom Friedman interviews, before there was Goldberg, there was Friedman, remember? Okay, so in one of his Friedman interviews, he talked about that the biggest threat to our Sunni Arab allies are not coming from Iran invading, it's from domestic threats. Yet, he's willing to, still sign on to these massive contracts, although there was a report recently quoting an unnamed U.S. government official saying, it would be better if they bought less combat aircraft and focused more on special forces and maritime because they could push back better against Iran with us if they were to do so. And I suspect that's a talking point more than, kind of you guys need to do more. If you really want to push back against Iran, we need to see your flesh in the game or skin in the game. So, and I don't think that's going to change because they're kind of addicted to their high-end, high-tech airborne platforms. Now, let me just wrap up in a moment here. So to conclude, let me just say, as I mentioned before, arms transfers are a necessary but not sufficient condition for assuring our allies. First of all, in this part of the world, personal relationships matter, and we know that our president is not big either in Washington or overseas with kind of the glad handing and kind of establishing the personal relationships that are so important to politics, and especially when you don't have a treaty relationship and the relationships are not institutionalized as they are not in the Gulf in many ways, although maybe between the militaries you could say they are, but on a political level they're not. You need to have that personal relationship, and that's why in many ways although George W. Bush caused a lot of frustration in the region. A lot of people there look back fondly, but he did invest a lot of effort into that. I also mentioned that I think because of all this stuff that's going on now in our country with regard to, this meme we hear now that, well, our allies really aren't such great allies in the Gulf. I mean, they're part of the problem. I think a lot of these arms transfers will come under greater scrutiny in the future. We've seen this in Sweden, where a major arms contract for airborne early warning and control craft was canceled a year ago. I don't think it'll come to that in France or the UK or the United States, because I think we're too committed, and the deals are just too lucrative to pass up. And politically, it has to do with the politics of the government in Sweden more than anything else. But I think things might change in ways that deals will get greater scrutiny than they have in the past. And then also the Israelis have been talking about concerns about their own qualitative military edge, which is enshrined in U.S. law since 2028. So, and now the only area I think that will affect things is the F-35 deal. The Israelis got a commitment apparently from the United States that we're not going to be selling F-35s anywhere in the Gulf anytime soon, and at least for 10 years they'll have, if not longer, they'll have a monopoly on that aircraft in the region. In terms of other weapon systems, I don't think that really will apply very much. So in the end, I think in many ways we have a lot of homework to do. In some ways we have the worst of all worlds, because at a time when our allies are less confident in us, we're selling more arms, and they feel that we are not providing a security framework in which they can act in, so they act on our own. So we're giving them the wherewithal to do things that we often find troubling, like campaigns in Yemen and the like. So this is the paradox of the current U.S. policy, and it's a dilemma which the next president will have to deal with. But I think in terms of actual assurance, this will have to await the next administration, because the relationships and the patterns of interactions are just so set in stone now, and there's a lot of repair work to do. So anyhow, I'll leave it at that. Look forward to the discussion.
Mike, thanks very much. You've given a very fact-rich, insightful presentation, and you ended up on a interesting note about the paradox of less assurance perceived, but more arms to do things that could be contrary to some U.S. views. You know, among all the interesting things you said, I'm afraid that the phrase that's going to stick with me the longest is the American forces sitting on their bayonets.
Well, that's probably not accurate either. No, from their point of view, in terms of what they consider to be important, I would say.
Caroline, you're playing the role that I often played in London as the loyal ally, but not totally part of the brought into the picture. So give us your perspective on this issue.
Sure. Is this on? Oh yeah, that's working. I'll just sort of give you a very brief outline of the way we've been approaching this over the last year or so. I mean, the UK has centuries-old links and ties. I think we first opened a trading post in the Gulf in 1622 or something like that. So we go back a long way. But having said that, a couple of years ago, in all honesty, there was a recognition across government that all of the different engagements, including defence, but across the board from the government, engagement with the Gulf, wasn't really adding up to the sum of its parts. And perhaps we'd moved into a slightly more transactional relationship with our Gulf partners than we really wanted to. So the current British government made a commitment to really invest in those partnerships for the long term, to really support the essential development and reforms that we think really underpin Gulf security. Now, we define security very broadly. We're looking at the long term as well as the immediate threats. So this broader approach encompasses working with Gulf states on education, on good governance and the rule of law, and respect for human rights, those issues. We're engaging with the next generation of civil society and government leaders, and also working obviously with them on prosperity interests. It was mentioned the personal relationships. There's been a big effort, I think, to have much more consistent and regular dialogue at the high level, but as I said, also building those people-to-people links as well through education and through the arts. All of that said, obviously a big part of that is our defence relationships with the Gulf partners, and we're cooperating with them on a whole range of things in terms of resilience building, criminal justice and law enforcement, but also obviously arms sales and our presence there. Getting on to defence reassurance, I think, obviously we wouldn't see it as compensation. It's much more about building a long-term partnership with allies in the Gulf so we can face these threats that we feel we jointly have to tackle. And I think my personal sense is that the demand isn't really for arms sales and kit. It's much more about establishing a more permanent and deeper presence and more, more effective cooperation in the region. The UK is the second largest Western defence force in the Gulf, although I think, as I proudly say, that we have over 1,600 personnel. It rather pales into insignificance in terms of numbers, but for the UK, that's a significant commitment. And then last year we had our strategic defence and security review, in which, amongst other things, we committed to maintaining a 2% GDP spend on defence, and part of that is investment in the Gulf. One of the commitments was to build a permanent base in Bahrain, so that started. A new naval base is under construction. and we're also looking at more permanent teams embedded with Gulf militaries in the region. We're assisting with capacity building across the range, and it sort of touches a bit on what Mike said. We actually do think there's value in engaging on what we consider some of the real threats, so less sort of classic, I guess, defense engagement, but looking at counterterrorism, financial crime, cyber governance, and the capacity to tackle cybercrime. So coming on a little bit to, are we on the same page? Because obviously the Iran deal came whilst we were establishing this new approach. I think we're on the same page in terms of needing to work together to tackle those threats and the ongoing dialogue about what those threats really are and how they're manifested both in the Gulf and externally across the region. And we're not naive about Iran. We have continued to try and tackle Iran's malign influence in the region where we think it can be tackled. But we do also think that our engagement with Iran has value. And I guess that there is sense in trying to foresee at some point a de-escalation between the Gulf states and Iran, and thinking carefully about how we can help do that whilst not underestimating the very real concerns that our Gulf partners have. As I said, I don't think that's downplaying the threats that they face, but we really want to work with them. I'll just sort of finish up, I think, and say, look, I don't think this is mutually exclusive. This is about striking a balance between trying to pursue what we believe is in our national security interests. It's obviously, we thought the Iran deal, and we still believe the Iran deal was in our interests. But again, now, how do we manage the aftermath to try and reassure our Gulf allies in that way? And as I said, I think it's a bit less about just selling them lots of kit and much more about creating these enduring partnerships. I'll stop there.
Okay, that's great. So the UK doesn't see the sales as compensation because you're not leaving the region, and you don't see the need to compensate for criticism about the Iran deal. You probably don't get a lot of that criticism. It tends to come to the United States. But we can talk about that a little bit more during the discussion. Bilal, thanks for joining us. Your name and makes it sound like you might be from the region, but and I know that we want you to talk some about how it's playing out in terms of the geopolitics of the region, but I know you don't speak for anyone there, just yourself.
Well, I am from the region, but I'm also American. There's no incompatibility there. There's a lot that's been said. I'm actually reorganizing my thoughts, so I don't want to repeat what's said. Let me start right up front by saying that reassurance is not really an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And for me, Gulf security really is what we should be focusing on. If we end up reassuring our partners, yet we end up with Gulf insecurity, and I'm not really very interested in that, quite frankly. Let me start with the bottom line because it's where Ellen actually ended, and Caroline has talked about that in length. So I think that the U.S. promotion and operationalization of burden sharing with some old and long-standing allies, including the UK and France, offers us a much more, and paired, of course, with a strategic dialogue with the Russians and the Chinese, the major adversaries, I think that's equally important than the first part, offers us, I think, a much more sustainable U.S. Gulf security strategy moving forward. So I'm going to focus on that, even though it's not going to happen today or next week, but for the next 10, 15 years, how we should be thinking about Gulf security and how reassurance fits into that, if that's okay with you. Okay, so there's not a whole lot of interoperability as far as operational tactical because we sell different hardware. It's just not going to change anytime soon. So I think we're better off talking about political strategic interoperability because this is where we have an opportunity of actually talking about how we can harmonize our strategies, exactly what Caroline was talking about, our approach, our common visions, and really working together. I mean, we have been very frustrated with partners and even allies in Europe free riding, yet we on our own have been very much at fault for not thinking much more seriously about the concept, which is the antidote to free riding, of burden sharing. So I think it all starts here. I think it all starts in Washington. For all of this to work now into the future, it all starts here in the sense that we have to make up our mind and we have to come up with a decision, and I think it's a very important one. How much do we want to, let me use the same words that the president said, share the region actually, and specifically the Gulf, with some long-standing allies, including the French and the British, who exactly as Caroline mentioned, have made some very serious decisions to go back and to establish permanent presence. Of course, the French are more in Djibouti, but they have quite a considerable presence still in the Gulf, not to mention in the UAE in particular. That decision has to happen sooner rather than later because it offers us, it offers our allies a much more effective strategy to not only reassure the partners, but also to preserve Gulf security now into the future. So let me talk about the specifics of what really I have in mind as far as burden sharing, okay? I think the P5+1 model has been a very useful diplomatic construct to get to the nuclear deal. So why don't we borrow a little bit from that and actually get into a P3+1 model for Gulf security now into the future. P3 being, of course, the United States, France, the UK. The plus one here is the Gulf Party. Now, the Gulf Party, of course, would be either a leading Gulf state, and let's not kid ourselves, most likely Saudi Arabia, or the GCC as a whole. Now, I think pretty much everybody in this room knows what the ideal scenario would be, a more preferable scenario is, which is the GCC as a whole, basically, working multilaterally with the P3s. But we also all very much are aware that the concept of multilateralism within the GCC is more of a myth than a reality, quite frankly. And we all know the differences. There's no need to rehash them right now. But regardless of what format it is, that decision has to be made by the Gulf partners themselves. They basically decide who would participate in this new forum, if, by the way, they're interested in it. Now, they might not really be very excited about the French and the British stepping into this under U.S. leadership because of concerns about colonial past or what have you. But obviously, you know, the fact that the UK is back to Bahrain is, of course, with the consent of the Bahraini government. So I suspect, this is my own guess, having traveled to the region extensively over the past few years, that this construct will be well received by the Gulf partners on the condition that it will be actually under U.S. leadership. Now, the division of labor I see is actually quite simple. We remain committed to the high-level contingencies and the major deterrence functions that we have been performing for a very long time. The French and the British would help us out with the low-level, mid-level contingencies that have more to do with counterinsurgency and that have more to do with stability operations. They're, I think, much better than us at that because of their extensive, as Caroline said, and nuanced understanding of the region. I mean, there's a lot of British institutions in the Gulf, okay? And the personal relationships are old, and they know the societies better than we do. But I'll go back to what I mentioned before. It all starts here. We have to make a decision whether this is something that we want to employ now into the future. I think there's going to be a lot of resistance coming from the Pentagon, and to be more specific about the place where Ellen just came back from, CENTCOM, because let's be very honest, there's a lot of benefits to actually us doing it on our own. There's a lot of benefits to autonomy. It gives us utmost flexibility in terms of strategy, in terms of decision making. We don't have to consult with allies who, by the way, have far fewer military capabilities than we do. But we have to realize that Pax Americana in the Gulf is over. It's a controversial reality, but it is very true. I think a lot has changed in that region, and a lot of trends have happened, regional and international, that we have to really keep up with. In many ways, I come up to the conclusion that our utmost dominance in the Gulf is changing in many ways, and it's about time that we integrate in a very effective manner our British and French allies, who, like I said before, have made some very serious decisions, have integrated them into their own national security strategies. And by the way, the British government has a Gulf strategy. I'm not sure if it's published yet, but it was mentioned in the National Security Strategy of 2015. So returning to the region is not really a temporary decision. This is a very serious decision. Now, whether it's sustainable, we can get into issues as far as NATO, because that gets us into the future of NATO and the contributions of the French and the British into that. But it's, for now, something that they have committed to. And it's quite a remarkable achievement going back, knowing that the military presence on its own has produced mixed results as far as the United States is concerned. I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you, Bilal. I should have mentioned in introducing you that you've written directly on this subject, and you
Yep.
may have, we can promote your writing
Safe,
afterwards.
shameless promotion after Hubby
You know, when
spoke.
you, the idea of a P3+1 has a lot to speak for it, and then who the one would be, and the Saudis being the one also makes sense. But you know, when Ellen was talking about the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, and the Saudis being one of the parties that was not fully on board that, suggests that you know, they may be standoffish to that idea as well. I wonder if I could kick off the discussion by asking Ellen a little bit more about the NATO Istanbul Cooperative Initiative. Is it still an ongoing initiative? And what are the reasons why the Saudis did not want to participate fully in it? Bilal, I might ask you
Sure.
whether there is an analogy here that's worth value.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks, Mark. Well, first, I think we should remember that NATO's membership now is so large that it doesn't include necessarily just countries that have a deep historic commitment to the Gulf. So I think it's been harder for NATO to actually engage all of its member states in these activities. And then on the other side, the demand side, I think the Saudis had hoped to be the key partner. And the NATO very quickly defaulted to working bilaterally with each country. And so they developed sort of a legalistic approach of signing memorandums of agreement, et cetera. And then each country designed a kind of bespoke program of what specific activities it wanted to do with NATO. So some countries signed up for, you know, budget reform exercises, and some signed up for leadership training, and it sort of went down quickly to fairly specialized cooperation agreements, and sort of fell below the strategic level fairly quickly. My understanding is that it is alive, and the one new activity is that they're creating a center in Kuwait that will be a NATO center will be a platform for, you know, mid-career regional folks to rotate through and get training. All the GCC countries now get invited to the NATO activities in Naples, and they get invited to Brussels. And so they're trying to keep this as an ongoing but very ad hoc process. And it did occur to me that one of the dilemmas is that NATO is not necessarily the right forum to define the Iran threat, for example, because NATO, of course, is struggling a bit of what is its core mission and what's the threat environment that it's trying to address. And NATO is also not necessarily the best partner for some of the things that Caroline talked about, the soft security or the full spectrum of security, from resilience, maritime, you know, Coast Guard, counterterrorism, et cetera. NATO still is looking at the big picture, but is trying to respond to what the GCC countries have indicated their greatest interest is. Okay. But I think we get back, I mean, one of the themes that I think has come through all is that it still is, for the Gulf, a U.S.-centric problem set. They don't see any alternative to the U.S. as the key partner, even though we're on the cusp of some shift in the total dominance of the U.S. as the security partner.
Yeah, Bilal said that as well, that if the U.S. leadership was there, then it would be more receptive. But what's the Bilal, the relevance to your idea of these previous initiatives?
Okay, so that's obviously very well said by Ellen. I just have a slight disagreement on ICI. And the fact that the Saudis are not interested in ICI really has very little to do with ICI, quite frankly. I've been working on the issue for the past few months, trying to find areas of common interest and cooperation between NATO as a whole and the GCC countries. I'm going to say something very basic, but I think it's still important. Obviously, the French and the British are part of NATO, but that's not just NATO. If we're going to talk about really NATO as an institution and the GCC as an institution, that's almost an entirely different conversation. So the slight disagreement is as follows. I think ICI is dead. As a construct, it's dead. And I think that there's a concerted effort on the part of NATO today to repackage that in a way that the Saudis would be much more comfortable with it. Now, why were the Saudis not interested in ICI? Simply because it had nothing to do with the initiative. They were just not ready for it. They, as a government, as bureaucracies inside Riyadh, they were not ready for the concept of working with the NATO institution. That whole concept was quite new to them. And they were still at a stage of trying to digest what just happened with the relationship they have with the United States. You know, there's a psychological process here of, we had something really good going with the United States, and all of a sudden, and we used to pick up the phone and call the president and get most of what we wanted, okay? And now we can't do that anymore. And they're throwing NATO at us as an alternative. We're not happy with that. That's pretty much sums up the Saudi perspective on NATO. And getting involved with NATO really requires a lot of hard work, a lot of bureaucracies that are at sync, a lot of interagency meetings, and that was just something that the Saudis were not ready for. Beyond the strategic concept of really, is NATO something that could really boost our security and our interests? Right now we're at a stage where NATO is trying to repackage and make its case again to why this really is something that could be very useful for you. Not as an alternative to the US relationship or the French relationship or the British relationship, but something actually that could be complementary to that. At the end of the day, somebody has to push for it, okay? Whatever ideal the concept is, no matter how beautiful it is on paper, somebody has to push for it. Somebody from within Brussels, somebody from within Washington, somebody from within London, somebody from within Paris. Right now, that push is very modest from here. It is getting a little bit stronger at Brussels with Sandy Vershbow in particular. And as far as London and Paris, obviously it's much more complicated than that because, as Ellen has mentioned, and I agree with you 100%, the threat perception issue is just quite a challenge. The whole Iran versus ISIS, one of the most immediate security threats to us and to you, and how we can work that out, basically, it's going to present a challenge moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Bilal. I didn't mean to dominate the questions up here. Let's bring others into the conversation. We've only got one roving microphone, and I'm going to pass it, first of all, to Barbara, and in the usual fashion, identify yourselves.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. I'm going to give you a theoretical and ask how each of you would respond to it. There's a massive rebellion in eastern Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi government is having tremendous difficulty putting it down. Given what Obama told Friedman before he told it to Jeffrey Goldberg, what does the United States do in a situation like that? Already we're implicated in Yemen, which has turned out to be a complete catastrophe. What do we do in the case of a massive internal threat to the Saudi regime?
Or something happens in Bahrain.
Well, Bahrain is perhaps easier because we have a military presence there, but either way.
Okay, let's take that, whoever wants to jump in. You can answer it, Caroline, from the perspective of what the UK.
Thanks, I think.
We won't make it totally US-centric. Anybody got a view on this? Hypothetical?
I'll just start by get Carolyn off the hook there. But I mean, we've been in this movie before in a way. I mean, with Bahrain, Egypt in a way. I mean, there's no way we can resolve the tension between our interests and our values on this one. And we'll always be torn on this one because we have a fundamental commitment to the survival of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and for good reason. Yet we have a fundamental commitment to our values and a responsibility that when we arm people, that they act in accordance with the laws of armed conflict and international law. And we're not very good at convincing other people to fight the way that we think they should be fighting. I mean, all you have to do is look at the Saudi air campaign in Yemen. It's not, where there's a lot of, I think, disquiet about the way it's been handled, and likewise with Sisi's handling of the opposition and the Bahraini government's handling of the opposition. it never ends nicely. I mean, I think, look, it's a hypothetical, so I don't, without knowing the exact context and if there's external involvement or not, whatever. But, I mean, I think and again, the context in which it happens, if it was as a result of, government overreach, that's one thing. And if it's a result of foreign meddling, it's another thing. But yeah, okay. I don't want to go into the, I'll just say the general principle is it's kind of an insoluble problem for them, for us, because it's in our interest to support the survival of these regimes, especially at a time when the state system is under great stress. That should be the fundamental commitment of our foreign policy, and that's why we support, Rojava, or at least, PYD in northeastern Syria and KRG in northern Iraq, and the government of Iraq in Baghdad, and the government in Amman, Jordan, and likewise in Saudi Arabia. So that should be our fundamental consideration. But we should do everything we can to influence them, knowing that we're probably not going to be very effective, to do it in a way that is in conformance with international law and in many cases their own laws, probably.
Ellen?
So I think it depends what the Saudis ask us to do. I think that if the Saudis ask us to lay low and be very, hands-off, we would probably respect that, but we would also be doing independently, trying to assess how it happened, why it happened, what the ramifications are over the border. If the Saudis insisted that it was all being manipulated by Iran, then I think that we would have a responsibility to try to find out whether that was true or not, and to try to diffuse this from escalating into a regional conflict. So I think there are roles that the United States can play somewhat at its own initiative, but in support of not letting a crisis like that have larger consequences. But I think we would also be very sensitive to how in a dialogue with Riyadh of what would be helpful and what would be counterproductive.
And if I could just add one quick thing. Sure. By and large, criticism, for the most part, should be private. There are times for public criticism, but I think one of the problems I think we're dealing with now is the fact that we have a president who gives his post-presidential interviews while he's still in office and says things that really should not be said publicly. There's nothing wrong with saying it privately, but there's no good comes out of that, and I don't understand why. And I guess we just have a different way of looking at the world. And he's the president, so he wins.
We don't all have to jump in, but if we have something to say, please.
Well, just to jump in, I mean, I'm glad you said that, Mike, because as a member of my government, it could be a potentially career-ending moment if I get too far into hypotheticals. So I'm not really going to get into what would we do, but just 2 points I think I'd make. One is, I think it's worth looking at our broader approach to the Arab Spring and some of the principles that guided that I think gone are the days of just supporting stable dictatorships. To be clear, that's not what I'm saying Saudi Arabia is, but yes, looking at trying to promote the kind of values that we want to see. And then I'd also just say, this is actually why the strategy that Bilal talked about also works hard on people-to-people links, building those values into society and helping the Gulf societies actually make those slow changes and reforms that we think are good for Gulf stability and security, but also working with them. It's not something we're trying to impose. So that's all I'll say.
I mean, what will be a series of violent agreements with Ellen? I'll echo what she said. I'll take it one step further. We side with the government. But we pick up the phone 24 hours later and tell them what happened, and we have a very, very serious conversation about reform. But at the very moment of it, we side with the government.
Let's come back. Stanley Roth in the third row, and then after him, the gentleman right in front.
Stanley Roth, recently retired from Boeing, my real credential, graduate school colleague of Ellen Labson.
Yeah.
I found the panel surprisingly optimistic, which may surprise you because I doubt you thought your presentations were optimistic, but it strikes me that the situation is far worse than described. Just a couple points. One, on the arms sales, I think the bottom line is U.S. arms sales have been a negative because of the process in terms of reassurance rather than a positive. The fact that it takes many years to get a sale through, the fact that Kuwait can't figure out what they've done wrong, that a sale's been pending for so many years, Qatar more complicated because of some of the government's behavior, the influence of QME, which was only mentioned in passing, but has a huge impact, belief by many in the Arab world that the Israel aid compensation package, it's got to be completed before these sales get approved. Maybe wrong. We'll see what happens this week. But despite having sold enormous quantities of highly sophisticated weaponry, it's mostly been a negative, and its perception is that it's easier to deal with the Europeans than it is to deal with us. So I think it hasn't been a reassuring factor. Second, I agree with what was said about relationships, although I thought the description of it was polite. I think the relationships are largely awful, and we're seeing some of that in the treatment of the president on this trip. But third, I think we underestimated the policies. I think the Gulf countries believe that Iran policy is a failure. They're looking at the non-nuclear aspects of Iranian behavior since the agreement. They see it getting much worse, provocative towards the U.S., and they think we're naive and we don't have a response. So I think when you combine all those three things, I think the reassurance definitely has to be a comprehensive set of policies, and I think you're right, Michael, that it's going to have to be the next administration. Just trying to provoke some.
Okay, there wasn't a question in there, but it certainly could be much fodder for a comment if any of the panelists want to comment on any aspect of that.
The connection that I was making, Stan, when you were talking is that, it is true that our own system, we are so choked by the layers of rule of law, regulations, congressional approvals, et cetera, that we're not nearly as agile an actor as other countries want us to be. In addition to how slow it is for us to finish transactions with the GCC, just look at how much trouble we're having figuring out at the Treasury Department what we can and cannot do to fulfill our obligations to Iran under the Iran agreement. So I think those are two parallel stories where America's capacity to act as a great power is constrained by our own internal procedures, that we just don't know when to stop processing issues and just move forward. So I take that point, and I do agree with you that there's been an erosion, I think, of confidence in us as a security partner because we, finish all these plans and then we are so slow in executing the plans. But let's be fair, there's also a parallel predicament on the other end, which is that the Arab countries sometimes make these purchases and then don't really finish the training or the deployment, or sometimes these are fancy gadgets that sit on the shelf and that don't really turn out to be what we had envisioned them to be in terms of self-sufficiency. And I think one thing that we've not sort of addressed head on is whether a more self-sufficient Gulf region is, inevitable, and is it kind of a net positive for the region, even if it forces a recalibration of U.S. relations with the Gulf.
Thanks, Ellen. Bilal?
Well, first of all, congratulations on your retirement. Last time I saw you was in Crystal City. Okay, so everything you said, I 100% agree with. I would just slightly challenge the net negative of arms releases. I think on balance, you're right. It really hasn't made a dramatic, improvement in the reassurance matrix, right? But looking at the demand side of it, I mean, the way they see it, it's a major part of the reassurance business. And so we still have to commit to weapon sales that recently have been very much in need in active combat operations, whether it's in Yemen or perhaps future theaters, I'm not sure where. That has actually contributed positively, really, to improving the reassurance equation. So I don't agree that it's been a net negative throughout. As long as they ask for it and we respond in a very ineffective, bureaucratic, slow manner, I understand that. I can't tell you how many workshops I've run on export controls. I'm not sure we're there yet, even though this president has committed to reforming the process more than any other. And another gentleman who's also retired, who's worked very personally on that, Tim Hoffman over at DITSA, will just provide you with a PowerPoint presentation that's just remarkable. Nobody will understand except him about what this administration has done as far as export controls. But to say that it's been a net negative, I would just slightly disagree with that.
Thanks, Bill. Michael.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said about the frustrations that a lot of our partners have with regard to the foreign military sales process. But to be honest with you, they've been dealing with that for decades, and they lived with it. But I think now it comes against the background a particular political context where, from their point of view, and actually I would argue from my point of view too, we make decisions, and from their point of view, errors that have geopolitical consequence, that have kind of tectonic effects on the region, and then we sell arms that really cannot even begin to deal with the problems that we've created. So, and it's kind of like putting a bandage on a gaping wound, from, I think, and I think that's, and you could look at, Iraq and then Syria and from their point of view, and maybe my point of view, the Iran deal. So I think, again, that's the context in which it occurs against, and that's really, the arms deals, they need them. It needs to be part of the relationship, but it can't even really begin to deal with the tectonic shifts that we've initiated in many ways by things either we did or didn't do. I'll just say one more thing in terms of, silver linings. I think we've seen a change in the strategic culture of a lot of our Gulf Arab partners, in that, now they are, never before were they willing to do things on their own. They always kind of waited to act within a framework created by the U.S. When they felt that there no longer was one, they finally have gotten to the point where they're able to do things on their own. Now, it'll be harder if we have a next president who has a more forward-leaning, kind of more traditional approach to the Gulf, which might be hard because I think we're going to be spread thin. This gets to Bilal's paper. We with Asia and Russia, we can't focus on the Gulf the way we have in the past. We don't have that. We won't have that luxury anymore. And we'll need our allies more than in the future than we have in the past to help us. And that's an area where if we can somehow manage our kind of return to the Gulf psychologically, we're still there militarily, but I mean on a psychological level in terms of a president who's focused on that as well as other problems, and harness that the change in the strategic culture of our allies, the willingness to do more things on their own, that could be a net gain. As long as we provide the security framework in which they act, I think that will be potentially a net gain, but it'll be a more difficult relationship because they'll be more independent in the future in the way they look at things than they have been in the past. So it'll be a more normal alliance like we've had with our European partners, where there's more give and take, and so.
It's not an alliance, though, right? So
well, okay. I know Bilal wrote a piece on this. I have a less formalistic approach to this. I really do think it is an alliance, though it's not. There's no treaty. There are informal, commitments, and I still think it's an alliance. I think you could use that word if you're, not too particular. I mean, if you look at the end results, we've been at war several times in the last several decades in this part of the world. And you look at the language in the NATO treaty, which basically gives each country the ability to respond as they see fit to an act of aggression. We never really had NATO tested, except after 9/11. I mean, we never had a real test of NATO in terms of what it was set up to do. Thank God. So, I think I use the term alliance,
Okay.
but I'm less formalistic.
Okay. Caroline, you wanted to say something.
Just a really quick word on the Iran deal, partly because it's an issue very close to my heart. I mean, I think the fact that our Gulf allies don't think it was a good deal doesn't change our judgment that it was. I think we still believe it was in our national security interests. We do actually still believe that it can be a positive in terms of reducing tensions in the region long term, and where we are now is trying to achieve that and managing the disagreements. So I think we're still in the middle of this at the moment.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
Mark, just two finger on the export reform process, just very, very quickly. I mean, it's a join the club situation where it's not just the Gulf partners who are actually very much fed up with it. It's also the Europeans. The British, the French, the Poles, the Italians, everybody's fed up with the system. So it's the export control process and the reforms that have been just very much, incomplete. So it's not just the Gulf region. It's basically the long-standing allies also who are just fed up with it.
Okay. Gentleman in the second row up here. And then after that, Adam.
Hi, my name is Mark Kim, and I've got a passing interest in these issues here. 3 quick points to each of you, but then I'm going to ask the maximalist question about the mutual defense guarantee that was proposed at the end of the last administration, considered by the end of the last administration, certainly advocated by our Gulf partners. First of all, your point, Bilal. Our friends in CENTCOM, the Pentagon, would be absolutely delighted to give up the monopoly on providing military assistance and the lead for that. My colleagues from the Joint Staff J5 are here. I'll ask them to challenge that or not. The second point, Mike, I think the absolute worst proxy for military capability is the amount of money they spend on it. I mean, you take a look at what we have done through USMIDM, through Military Assistance Program Jordan, and all those other organizations. And frankly, I'll take a couple of dozen lone service officers out of the British Empire before I'll sell them a couple more F-16s. Third, Ellen, you talked a lot about what's happening in the GCC conversations right now, but I think it's important to remember that the Gulf Security Dialogue that addressed all the issues we're talking about here is 12 years old, started by John Hillen, my predecessor at State Department, and it addressed every one of these specific issues that they are now struggling with in the GCC. The problem has rarely been our assurances to the Gulf or our unwillingness to work with the Gulf partners. It's primarily that of the Gulf partners unwilling to work with each other. But what about the notion of a mutual defense guarantee, not these low-level, Bilal, you and I have talked about this a lot, not these low-level assurances that can be backed out at any time, but a formal Article 5 type agreement within the region, as we've given NATO for many, many years, and even in these days where our situation with the Russians has gone back and forth, we've maintained the Article 5 guarantee to those nations. So let me ask, just for the sake of provocation, views on that last issue on the Article 5 guarantee for the Gulf.
Ellen, why don't you start?
Well, I don't know enough about it, but I wonder whether it's actually more plausible as the Gulf countries become stronger and more confident actors. So maybe instead of a kind of paternalistic relationship, quite frankly, between the very large security provider and countries that in the past have been quite passive and waiting for the external security partner to define a security strategy. As these countries become more capable, and I really do think we've seen a strong evolution of their, how their ministries of defense perform, what they're trying to quickly learn how to do themselves, how their capacity to initiate hard decisions about the use of force themselves, if it's not always perfectly compatible with what the U.S. might have preferred. But as they become stronger actors, maybe your scenario becomes more meaningful in a way, that it's not us sort of collecting clients to sign on the dotted line, but it could be a few years from now a more balanced partnership.
Well, I
Yep.
just remind you that we had the Article 5 guarantee for NATO in 1949. We did not allow Germany to have the hemisphere until the following year. So in terms of maturation, the Article 5 guarantee was certainly put in at a time when Germany didn't even have an army.
Well, but that's not the reality that you're asking us to address now. We're looking at modernizing defense sectors in very small countries, in countries where the capacity to have the complex security processes that we have has not been there. But if it's evolving over time, maybe it becomes a more interesting option for the U.S.
So when I wrote my piece in Foreign Affairs about what an alliance means, I was also very clear on the fact that I didn't argue that we shouldn't have alliances. I was just describing an objective reality. And you know this, Mark. Last year, I wrote a report making the very clear case that actually we should have that type of guarantee with the Gulf partners. And I laid out, and I know it's a very serious commitment, I laid out very honestly the challenges, the risks of that, but also the opportunities. So I'm on the record actually saying that we should have a mutual defense treaty with at least the willing parties in the GCC, those who want it. Those who don't, that's fine too.
Other views?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm not a big fan of kind of Article 5 type commitment with our, partners or whatever you want to call them in the Gulf. And first of all, I'm not sure if you're talking about something that would require Senate confirmation. I'm not sure it would pass muster, and and that would in many ways be more damaging politically than not doing it at all. And I think the system in the past when we've had. Again, I don't mean to sound, this is not a political comment, but when we've had presidents whose commitment to the security of our partners there is clear, that's much more important than having a formal agreement in which you're not quite sure whether they really will, answer their obligation. Look, we had, and I don't want to beat this dead horse, but the red line in Syria. We had a president basically put his word on the line in public, although it was kind of, the language he used was very passive. It was very passive. It'll change my calculus and it'll have consequences. Well, yeah, people will die from chemical weapons. Yeah, I guess you could say. But he put it out in a way I think that was very problematic, which I thought foreshadowed his ultimate the way he would respond if he was tested. But so again, I would prefer to have informal commitments that are based on a very strong personal relationship in which there's no question about the commitment of our president, rather than a formal agreement that people are not really sure will honor when the time comes. Yeah.
Sorry, just microphone.
Yeah. Okay.
We want people who might be watching live
Yeah.
to catch the question.
Okay.
Well, my point back to you, Michael, is going back to the topic of this discussion. How do these informal arrangements go to the topic of this conversation, which is reassurance?
Again, because I believe that in this part of the world, personal relationships are more important than institutions. I mean, that's the way these governments in many ways are organized, and that's the way business is done very often. And again, it doesn't matter on our end if the president is lukewarm about it. If we have a formal agreement, if he in his mind says, damn, my predecessor signed that, I just don't believe in it, and I'm not gonna, damn it, if something happens, I ain't gonna sign on to that. So I just still think part of it is making the case why this part of the world matters. Okay, part of the problem we're facing right now is the president made a statement about, we're no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, so who really cares? Which to me kind of blew my mind, because even though it's not important for us, it's very important for the part of the world that we're rebalancing toward, and our economy is profoundly dependent on that part of the world. So it still should be, the Middle East oil still should be important for us for that reason, even if it's derivative. So part of the problem is just winning the debate over why the Middle East is still important. And there's a debate now, and I think I've never seen a period in my life where there is more disagreement over fundamentals of American interests, and at least, well, maybe, I'm sure, at least in the Middle East, and why we're there, and that the debate needs to be had again, and we need to, understand why we're there. So.
Bilal, another short.
Yeah, just very quickly. I agree with Mike. There's a risk if it goes to the Senate, but we wouldn't send it to the Senate unless we are almost, in a good position, knowing that this would not be a major battle. I don't think the Senate ratification would be a major challenge. So I'm very much aware of the critical role the U.S. Congress plays in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, just ask Jimmy Carter when it got to the SALT II talks. But the White House sets the tone. If the relationship between the White House and the Senate is good, there's no reason why something like this would be blocked immediately in the Senate.
Adam Early, the second row to the back. Second row to the back.
Hi, I'm Adam Early from Mercury, and I wanted to pick up on something that Michael said. It was in my mind before he said it, but if we could elaborate it on a little bit. I mean, obviously we're all here because we have an interest in the Gulf. We think it's important, but it strikes me that we may be just talking to ourselves because other people don't. And, all the points we're making about, what do we need to do to reassure the Gulf states? Well, the Gulf states, from what I'm hearing, believe that they don't matter to the United States anymore.
Well, the president told them in a way.
And the United States has moved on, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, whether it be Syria, whether it be, So my question to you is, if you were to, and whoever wants to answer this, please feel free, but, if you were trying to make the case to a senior American policymaker who has a lot on his or her plate and a lot of demands on resources, economic, political, military, so you were advising or trying to persuade them that, look, these guys matter and they are worthy of our attention and our commitment and our resources, what arguments would you make?
Why do they matter?
And not only do they matter in an absolute sense, but relative to other demands for our attention.
I have a kind of a flippant response to that, we've learned that if you don't visit the Middle East, it visits you, okay? And that I mean, President Obama is not the first president who tried to wash his hands of the region and found that the region kind of imposes itself on his agenda. In part because, look, even if Middle Eastern oil is not as important to us as it was in the past, like I said, it's important to our allies and their economies, and therefore it's important to us. And plus, the Middle East is a source. Look, it's becoming increasingly negative that the Middle East is a source of increasingly of violence and terrorism and the export of violent extremism. And what happens with regard to trends in Arab Islam has implications for diaspora communities and Muslim communities around the world, at least certain fractions of those communities. So whether we like it or not, we need to be engaged there because if oil is disrupted or there's a civil war in Syria and people get radicalized, it spreads because the Middle East has moved west and east also in many ways. So it's a negative argument. And to be honest with you, I make my career about it by being a Middle East specialist. But I'm the first to say, Asia offers much better opportunities in terms of a bright future. But you can't afford to ignore the Middle East simply because it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just this. Right now, unfortunately, it's at a place where a lot of bad is coming from the region. And we have to deal with it because it'll affect us whether we do or not.
Okay, I think everybody might agree with that. There are about 4 other people who signaled an interest, and I'll probably start grouping them. But I want to make sure that I give anybody who comes from the Gulf an opportunity to speak either in defense or pose a question. So anybody from the region wants, or they get a little priority here. Okay, gentleman in the front, please.
Hi, Salman Jalama from the Embassy of Bahrain. I wasn't planning on speaking, but since you asked. I think a big part of the problem is that a lot of these initiatives to stabilize the region have been US-led. And when you're talking about a region that's across the Atlantic, when there are political barriers, cultural barriers, language barriers, that makes it very difficult for the US to understand fully the sentiments that are actually on the ground. And I think we saw that happening with the entry into Yemen by the Saudis. It was one of the first times in most recent times that the Saudis have, or the Arab world, has taken an initiative on their own. And the formation of the Islamic coalition, we saw that as well. So I think in terms of reassurances, I still don't think that the US may understand exactly what the Gulf states need to be reassured. Yes, FMS sales, and yes, talking about maritime cooperation, talking about a lot of kind of these broader subjects that may are means to an end, but I don't think the rhetoric has matched the tactical approach. So maybe we've been, I guess, hitting this nail on the head too hard, but if we ask very simply, what does the Gulf need right now to feel like we have, at least the U.S. has their back?
So it's kind of a rhetorical question.
I mean, I think in just trying to without too much lingo, specifically, what can be the outcomes of the Camp David of the Riyadh summit that will make them leave? And I think that a lot of the issues have been certainly around Iran. And I think post-deal world, there has still not been a sufficient amount of reassurances that the deal has given, or the fruits of the deal to date.
Caroline, I want to maybe put this to you, because you've spoken in defense of the deal.
Yeah.
And I share your view, actually, but I'm not one of the panelists here. But is there some way that the deal will evolve that will in itself provide the reassurance to get to some of the root anxieties?
I mean, I think, as I said, we're only 6 months after, where were we? July. We're only a couple of months after implementation date when we've started to see the deal actually in practice. Our view, the UK's view, is that it does offer at least the opportunity for Iran to judge for itself that engaging in a more constructive way and a less aggressive way is in its own country's interests. So its economic interests, its ability to engage both with the West and in the region. I'm not saying that that's guaranteed, and as I said, it's still very early days, but I think that's our vision for one of the potential impacts of this deal. And just the fact that it removes this enormous obstacle that we all had in terms of engaging with Iran, that at least it gives us the chance to try and explore some of those options. But like I said in my opening remarks, we're not naive. We're not just sort of blindly saying everything's going to be fine now because we've got this deal. We're still working across all strands in terms of both tackling what we see as unhelpful behavior from Iran, but at the same time, trying to keep that option open. It's one of the reasons that we reopened our embassy in last year, shortly after we achieved the deal, mostly because we felt that we had enough assurances in terms of our staff safety. The reason we pulled out was because our embassy was overrun. It wasn't actually to do with the nuclear deal or Iran's nuclear behavior. But just the seeds of opportunity to start engaging in that way, that again, just start helping Iran see that it's in its own interest to perhaps de-escalate.
Thanks very much, Caroline. I'll take a couple of questions together. Okay, so there were gentlemen far on the left over there, and then there was somebody else over there. Yeah, then the same row.
All for an excellent discussion. My name is Nima Garam. I'm speaking in a personal capacity. You all have addressed in some fashion the challenges in satisfying the requirements of deterrence simultaneously, deterrence, assurance, and acceptability. So in a post-JCPOA environment, can you all, just curious for your views to weigh in, what role do nuclear security guarantees play in a post-JCPOA environment? Thank you. And I just recalling Secretary Clinton's remarks in 2009, pre-JCPOA, is there, leaving some of the political challenges aside, is there a future for extending nuclear umbrella or not? Next administration. Thanks.
Thanks, Nima. That kind of is like the Article 5
There's no need for a nuclear umbrella.
commitment. Okay, same row.
Sure, Byron Callan. I'm an analyst at Capital Alpha Partners. I wonder if you can think about over the next 5 to 10 years. Micah, you talked about the number of arms deals that have been announced, but how do you think this current quest for security prompts these countries to diversify their sources, where they're getting their defense equipment from? And I want you to specifically address China, Turkey, and Korea as potential entrants or potential countries that could move more into the fore here. Thanks.
Michael, I think he was looking at you when he asked that question. But Caroline, if you want to say anything about diversity, you don't have to.
We're addressing that now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Both. Yeah. We're going to address both questions: the nuclear umbrella and the diversity.
Okay, I'll just. To be honest with you, I don't know enough about the Turkish arms industry, the Korean, a little bit about China. I mean, again, I think there's a very strong, because I think the countries of the Gulf see a lot of these purchases as related to a political and strategic relationship. Right now, I think for that reason, it'll still be the United States and the Europeans that will be able to, and that's why I said that's why the Russians, I think, have been, kind of lost their market share in the Gulf, although they made it up, in Egypt and in Algeria and Iraq now, and maybe Iran in 5 years or maybe sooner, who knows, we'll see. So I think right now it'll depend on the politics and, maybe Turkey, I don't know, Korea, China. Still, Korea's too small and far away. Maybe for niche, if they have some niche capabilities that are appealing. China, unless they play a political role in the Gulf in the future, I suspect, again, unless they have niche capabilities that they can't get elsewhere, it'll still be mainly the traditional suppliers, minus Russia.
Ellen or Bilal, do you want to address the nuclear umbrella question?
Bilal can go first, and then I'll.
I thought our policy was prevention. So the moment we change our policy as far as the Iranian nuclear issue, and then we'll talk about that. But for now, we have enough firepower in the region to destroy the Iranian military whenever you want it. But unless we change the policy, then we'll talk about nuclear umbrellas.
I mean, I still think we have more work to do to delegitimize reliance on nuclear weapons, to try to persuade the Iranians to stay in their non-nuclear status indefinitely. So I think that it's a very complicated package, I think, when we, I quite agree that I think the United States has enough, cumulative national power to deter without explicitly referring to the potential scenario of use of an American nuclear weapon in the region. So I would prefer to stay away from that topic and talk about America's presence, partnerships, et cetera, in a more, holistic way. And again, I wish that we could do more to delegitimize reliance on nuclear weapons in general, because I think it would help strengthen the utility of the agreement we signed with Iran.
Thanks, Ellen. Any last questions? I know there are a couple hands, but they're not raised anymore. You want another bite at the apple, Barbara?
It's not often we have so many distinguished experts. Why should we be concerned about the Iranian missile program? They put a self-imposed limit on it. They say they won't develop ICBMs. There's been so much of a kerfuffle over it. They claim they need it for deterrence because we're funneling all this stuff to the Gulf. Isn't that a legitimate argument?
I know you've got to be on this,
Okay,
Michael.
yeah. I mean, look. First of all, they do play a role in deterrence. They also play a role in intimidation and coercion. And you don't see a parade without a missile that doesn't have "Death to America." Israel should be wiped from the face of the map. So practically. Secondly, I don't really take their commitments at face value because they are working on space launch vehicles, although perhaps I'll defer to Mike Elliman if he's still here, maybe at a reduced pace, but, the capabilities they're developing in that program, will provide them eventually the capability, should they decide to do so, to build ICBMs. And there's a lot of stuff going on now between Iran and North Korea that's not, that's opaque, and that it's not clear what might be, in terms of sharing of technology or the like. So I wouldn't rule out. I think it was very important for them while they were negotiating the nuclear deal, to get out this line that they said we're not working on missiles greater than 2,000 kilometers because that, the Zionist enemy is within that range, but, we're not interested in threatening Europe. That was the implicit message there. We'll see if they stick to that in the future. But, it's true, they are dual use, but they are using them in a way that is enables them to intimidate their enemies and their neighbors. So I don't think they're playing a constructive role, the way they use them, currently, the missiles from the point of view.
Thanks, Michael. Very last question, gentleman in the middle. There.
Hi, I'm Shervin, an intern from NIAC. So we all want a stable region. And before it was Iran having nuclear weapons that was the threat. Now when when the world is reassured, it's Iranian missiles. And then we are talking about the country, Saudi Arabia, who has the third largest military expenditure in the world. They are not in a conflict right now, official conflict. So my question is, when will they feel reassured? What is the end game of Saudi Arabia? When are they reassured? Yes.
When are they going to be reassured? Who wants to answer that one?
Look, I think that countries are constantly obliged as sovereign states to think about their national security. It doesn't end. There's not a point at which you say, now it's all taken care of, no more to do. The U.S. still needs to address, how the threat environment changes over time. Maybe it won't be Iran as the #1 threat at some point in the future. But, remember, our conversation about reassurance is largely focused on, are the external actors doing their part, or are they coordinating? But with or without our reassurances, these countries have to constantly update and revise how they see the threat environment. It doesn't end. I don't think there's an end date to it.
Thanks, Ellen.
Yeah.
So thanks very much for addressing this question, for your active participation. To summarize very briefly, are the arms sales meeting the goal of reassurance? No. Are the arms sales from different countries complementary? No. How are the sales affecting the geopolitics of the region? Not too well. We got to do a lot more in different ways and get smarter about it. That's my workshop for dummies summary. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Good to see you.